The first sign of the unraveling came in the form of whispers, a series of inexplicable echoes carried on the dusty air. People would freeze mid-conversation, their eyes distant, as if listening to voices only they could hear. Scholars blamed glitches in communication networks. Spiritualists claimed it was the universe's attempt to speak, but none of the explanations rang true once physical evidence appeared. A city clock in Shore Lake, known for its precision to the millisecond, began ticking backward for a full day. When it resumed its normal pace, no one seemed able to explain why a whole cycle of nighttime had already come and gone. Reports of similar anomalies spread globally in the ensuing weeks. Children awoke to find the calendar date repeating. Street lamps flickered bright at noon, as though dawn still lingered. Then the first fissure opened in the center of a vast public park, swallowing leaves and scattering them across centuries like confetti. At first, the phenomenon was met with conflicting waves of skepticism, curiosity, and outright panic. The majority of critical government resources went into investigating the nature of these temporal rifts, or time tears, as the media called them. But the more people tried to record, measure, and analyze these tears, the worse they seemed to get. Geologists described them as cracks in the space-time continuum, fractures bridging different eras. Military forces cordoned off the torn areas. Researchers venturing too close came back changed some, arriving back before they supposedly left, while others never returned at all. Within months, cities worldwide changed beyond recognition. High-rises fell into ruin in a single night. Town squares were restored to a historical era, complete with horse-drawn carriages popping into existence like ghosts from centuries past. A sense of creeping dread fueled the scramble to preserve civilization. Citizens stockpiled food and water. They barricaded themselves indoors, only to find that one morning they would wake up in a future version of their homes, windows shattered, furniture rotted away in the unstoppable march of time. In other instances, entire neighborhoods were thrust into the past. Old newspapers from the 1800s littered the streets, while gaslit lampposts replaced the once bright LED lights. The government, fraught with internal chaos, resorted to martial law. Soldiers patrolled fracturing neighborhoods to keep frightened communities from spilling into the newly formed rifts. But there was no consensus on what to do if a break opened underfoot. Factions emerged, each clinging to a theory about how to manage time's dissolution or seeking to harness it for power. Amid this chaos lived Avon, a woman who had once been a dedicated science journalist. When the cracks first appeared, she reported earnestly on them for the city paper, hoping that transparency might help her fellow citizens cope. She had become a sort of messenger between research institutions and the common people. Over time, the mundane fact-checking she did proved futile. No two authorities agreed, and the facts themselves would change. Laboratories that had written up elaborate theories on stable quantum states would vanish overnight, replaced by centuries-old farmland or twisted, rusted steel. Commands from high-level officials contradicted themselves as new anomalies emerged, forming an endless spiral of misinformation. Rumors spread that the tears were accelerating and that the rifts would soon reach an apocalyptic threshold. Avin decided that writing could only do so much. If the pillars of logic were crumbling, she needed to face the phenomenon directly. It wasn't enough to watch from behind a lens, scribbling frantic notes about the latest bizarre developments. She wanted answers. Why was time unraveling? Why here and why now? And could it be reversed? She reasoned that if time itself had begun to loop, perhaps somewhere within those rifts was a path to stabilize everything, or at least an explanation for the strangeness enveloping the world. It was in the abandoned suburbs on the city's outskirts where she first witnessed a tear up close. Moonlight glinted off a jagged opening in the sky, a rip that hovered about a foot above the cracked asphalt of an empty street. No sound emanated from it, only a strange shimmer, like heat haze. When she peered inside, she glimpsed a patchwork of scenes. A burning field of wheat, a stone fortress from an unspecified medieval era, and a fleeting vision of her own bedroom from childhood. She was about to step closer when abrupt barking shattered her concentration. A guard dog, presumably left behind by its owners, snarled at her from a half-collapsed porch. Oven backed away, her heart pounding. Those images, swirling like a frantic kaleidoscope, persisted in her mind for days. She began collecting testimonials from others who had encountered smaller rifts. It seemed each vision was personal and unpredictable, an entanglement of private memory and unknown epochs. As the crisis deepened, the most influential faction trying to tackle the time tiers gathered in what was left of a high-security laboratory. They called themselves the Chronology Coalition, a patchwork alliance of scientists, mystics, and political opportunists with a single goal: to administer temporal anchors. The anchors were theoretical devices they believed might stitch together the rifts. They proposed forcing a consistent timeline by using electromagnetic pulses at locations where tears frequently opened. Skeptics labeled them charlatans, or worse. Others looked to them as the last glimmer of hope. Lacking alternatives, the government funneled any remaining resources into constructing these anchors. Avon was granted limited access to the coalition's base because of her experience chronicling the anomalies, and she eagerly joined their ranks to observe. She arrived one brisk morning to see the interior of the bunker, located beneath a half-collapsed sports stadium. The coalition scientists wore thick goggles and trailed wires from heavy backpacks that bristled with electronics. Generators whirred loudly, powering improvised machinery meant to concentrate electromagnetic waves. Avon's guide was an older engineer named Willem, who had served in the Air Force before the rifts emerged. He had the haunted look of a man who'd seen too much. Willem explained, while leading her past rows of flickering monitors, that the coalition had tracked an immense and growing fissure in the heart of the city. "Its readings fluctuate wildly," he told her. "We suspect it's the nexus for all these disruptions, a tear big enough to swallow entire blocks. It might be the key to ending this madness." That day, the coalition deployed a small team to investigate the city's largest fissure. Avon joined them, her pulse racing as she boarded a battered transport truck. The streets they rumbled through had turned desolate, unrecognizable. Litter drifted across lanes. Windows of long-shuttered shops were shattered, and every so often a swirl of temporal energy crackled in the distance. At the final checkpoint, soldiers placed portable metal barriers around tense neighborhoods. Beyond them rose a shimmering crack in the sky, the largest tier any of them had witnessed, maybe 3 stories high and contorting like a living thing. The raging swirl of it sent shockwaves across the adjacent buildings. Sections of road beneath it seemed to fade in and out of existence, revealing cobblestone from centuries earlier or the twisted wreckage of collapsed futures. Willem and several other coalition members set up the first temporal anchor. They hammered rods into the ground at precise intervals, connecting them by thick cables. The device powered on, sending arcs of electricity dancing along its frame. The air around them turned cold. Avon watched, transfixed, as the swirling mass of the fissure shuddered. A flicker of hope spread through the group. Maybe the anchor was working. Then a thunderous snap tore the air. A flash momentarily blinded Avon. When her vision cleared, she realized the device had short-circuited. The anchor's rods had snapped as if twisted by an unseen force, and the tear in the sky churned more violently than ever. Panicked, the coalition members scrambled to power it down. Some fled, worried they might be ripped from their own timeline if they stayed too close. Others stood in frozen horror as the tear expanded, swallowing the top floors of an adjacent building. Rubble collapsed in slow motion, as though time itself was second-guessing reality. Unable to tear her gaze away, Avon tried snapping pictures, but her camera malfunctioned. She saw glimpses of a figure in the swirling mass, one that mimicked her own features. The shock paralyzed her for several seconds. How could her reflection, or some older or younger version of herself, be etched into that chaos? Reacting on instinct, she rushed forward to help Willem, who was frantically trying to switch off the generator. The swirling rift was pulling them toward it, bits of loose gravel and debris dazedly floating upward as though gravity had lost its hold. Avon and Willem fought through the invisible current until abruptly everything snapped back into place. The tear stabilized for the briefest instant, just enough for them to fall backward onto solid ground. Then it began its destructive dance again. Bruised and shaken, they retreated to the transport truck, sparks flying from the damaged anchor equipment. As they hurried away from the scene, one of the scientists remarked in shock that they had read the generator's data feed backwards. The machine seemed to register that the tear had momentarily receded to the moment before they even arrived. This gave Avon an extraordinary, if terrifying, thought. Perhaps the rifts were capable of creating loops, remnants of events yet to happen, and echoes of events that had already transpired. If that was true, maybe there was a way to use these loops to their advantage. Maybe they could freeze things at a protective moment, or manipulate the timeline to sever the unending chaos. Willem was a man of stubborn resolve. 2 days later, working by the unsteady light of generator-powered lamps, he put together a plan. He theorized that the tear might have a time core inside it, an unstable pivot point that connected all possible variations of the future and past. If they could reach that core, they might introduce a stabilizing factor, forcing all realities to cohere. This, in his words, would be like injecting a stable note into a dissonant chord, compelling time to revert to a single key. It was the best theory the coalition had, however grim and slim the chance of success. They agreed to set up a second anchor, but this time, they would have a specialized module designed to emit the stabilizing signal directly into the tier's central swirl. This plan meant physically venturing into the rift. None of them were sure what that entailed. Would they be transported to random eras, torn asunder by the flux, or simply vanish? Nonetheless, Avon volunteered. "I'm no soldier," she told Willem, "but my entire life revolved around observing reality and explaining it to others. If there's any chance to set things right, I have to see it up close." Several volunteers joined her, including an ex-soldier named Lena, who had a reputation for unflinching courage. Lena prepared sets of grappling hooks and harnesses in case they had to anchor themselves, not to time itself, but to each other. Early morning light, filtered through a haze of dust, revealed the monstrous tier in the distance, larger than ever. Buildings beneath it flickered through their lifespans like a macabre slideshow. Pristine, then collapsed, then under construction, then obliterated, cycling. The plan was to extend a line with the stabilizing device as far into the fissure as they could manage, then hold it active long enough to inject the frequency that Willem hoped would unify the fractured timeline. Avon's heart thrummed as the truck halted. This time, the coalition team donned heavy harness suits with built-in sensors. They tested communications channels with the base. If anything, it gave them the illusion of preparedness. They approached on foot, stepping over pockets of jumbled time. 1 minute, puddles of water from the previous night's rain lay stark in the road. The next minute, the asphalt turned to mud. Avon could smell the stench of ancient farmland, only for it to fade as the scene shifted back to a contemporary echo. Finally, at the boundary of the rift, the world seemed broken into refracted shards. Dust motes were suspended mid-air. The whir from the stabilizing device in Avon's pack drowned out her own breath. With trembling hands, she pressed forward. The moment she crossed the threshold, a nauseating shift rippled through her. She found herself in the shell of a building close to the same location, yet not quite. The architecture was centuries older. Walls made of stone, windows no more than narrow slits. A swirl of wind battered her. Avon pivoted to see Lena behind her, eyes wide. They, along with a few others, stood in what looked like a half-formed reality, part fortress, part modern ruin. Their presence flickered from one timeline to the next. Avon's breath came ragged. The rift was a place where timelines collided, and these illusions were dangerously real. Sharp stone edges cut into her forearm, leaving a fresh scrape. If they lost their bearings, they could wander 1,000 years from their own era. Willem's voice crackled over the radio. "Keep moving," he urged. "Kitchen timer says you have about 10 minutes before the device overloads." Through static, he explained that any longer in that environment, and they'd risk short-circuiting the stabilizer, or being pitched into some random timeline. Holding each other with the tether lines, the group navigated deeper. Pale light illuminated a central swirl that loomed ahead like a miniature vortex, equal parts mesmerizing and destructive. One of the volunteers, a shy but brilliant temporal physicist named Runil, extended a scanning rod. The swirl's reading spiked wildly. "That has to be the core," he shouted over a bizarre hum that kept fluctuating. Through the swirling chaos, Avon again glimpsed a distorted image of herself. This time it felt like a direct confrontation. Steeling herself, she turned away from the reflection. The group moved closer, each step heavier than the last, as though the swirl was grappling with their presence. Suddenly, a blinding flash erupted from behind them. One of the tether lines snapped, and a volunteer vanished, yanked into the swirling dimension with a scream that was truncated instantly. The rest clung desperately to each other's harnesses, fear pounding in their veins. Lena anchored a hook into the uneven ground beneath them. The swirl let out a monstrous wail, or so it seemed. In that dreadful moment, Oven found a trembling sense of resolve. If they failed here, there would be no one left to fix the broken timeline. With a shaky exhale, she planted the stabilizing device on what felt like solid ground. Though it flickered from asphalt to grass to cobblestone in an eerie loop, Runil adjusted a dial on the device, murmuring instructions. Lena mustered her nerve and pressed a red switch. At once, a series of pulses emanated from the apparatus in measured waves. The swirling distortion exploded in a riot of color and noise. Avon felt as if everything around her was unraveling and reassembling at lightning speed. Fragments of the world whirled by. She saw her old apartment from childhood bursting into view, then centuries-old farmland, then a futuristic skyline she did not recognize. For a moment she grasped at the flickering illusions. Had the device backfired? Her heart pounded as an incredible heaviness pressed her down, as though gravity were multiplied. Over the radio, Willem's muffled voice crackled, barking some desperate words about "hold steady." The swirling rifts convulsed, then narrowed. The flickering illusions fused into a single, stable image. It was the city skyline, battered and broken, looped with stories of the past. Cracks in the streets sealed themselves. Broken windows reversed their impact, jagged shards reassembling into panes of glass. The swirling vortex shrank like a wound slowly stitching itself shut. Suddenly, a final pulse knocked Avon to her knees, and darkness overtook her. When she opened her eyes, she found herself lying on the cracked asphalt near the original location of the tear. Rain pattered on her face. The vortex was gone. All that remained was a faint shimmer in the air, like the residue of a vanished rainbow. Avon sat up, adrenaline still coursing through her veins. Lena was next to her, alive, although battered and sporting a long gash on her forehead. 2 other volunteers were present, equally dazed, but there was no sign of the one who had disappeared into the vortex. Avon tried to stand, swaying with vertigo. The city was half in ruins, cindered flare boarded up, paint flaking from abandoned vehicles, but time no longer felt as if it were cycling. The oppressive feeling of displacement had evaporated. They made their way back to the truck. Surprisingly, it started on the first try, and Willem's astonished voice came through the radio. "We see the tear is gone. Are you all right?" Avon replied, reason trembling in her tone. "We're alive and the device worked. The tear is closed, or stabilized." Although apprehension remained, there was a reason for optimism. The streets, while empty, felt grounded in a single timeline again. No flickers of farmland, no repeated nights. Avon recognized the battered storefronts and collapsed buildings for what they were, remnants of a single reality that had endured an unprecedented crisis. Over the following days, smaller tears around the region also vanished or shrank into harmless pockets of static, no larger than a coin. Government and military units, scattered though they were, took cautious steps to reestablish order. Some neighborhoods reappeared, as though they'd been lost in the fractal timelines. Others remained vacant, scoured clean by the swirling vortex. The calamity's damage was too severe to fully comprehend, yet the sensation of living in a world that might vanish underfoot at any second seemed to subside. At the Coalition's underground base, survivors gathered to update records, share stories, and plan reconstruction. Chronology Coalition scientists couldn't fully articulate how the device had succeeded. They theorized that by injecting a unifying frequency into the heart of the existential break, they had forced all timelines to overlap, and then collapse into the largest, most stable reality. Whatever the explanation, the vast majority accepted that time was no longer skittering away from them. Avon returned to her old apartment building to find it half standing. She carefully picked her way to her former unit, stepping around dropped beams and piles of shattered concrete. The hallway leading to her room was eerily silent, save for the crunch of debris underfoot. Her door had caved in, the interior exposed to the hallway. Part of the ceiling had fallen, revealing open sky. Dust motes swirled in the sunlight. She retrieved a small keepsake box she'd left behind when the anomalies became dire. Inside was an old watch that had belonged to her late father, ironically now just a piece of sentiment in a world that had nearly been undone by time. She slipped it onto her wrist. It wasn't working, but she vowed to fix it someday when resources allowed. Outside, the streets brimmed with survivors, who cautiously emerged from shelters and bunkers. Some wore expressions of grief, others of quiet determination. Their city had changed forever, and the ordeal had deepened scars in both their minds and their environment. Avon walked among them, uncertain of where to start. Her breath caught when she came across a group of children improvising a game with battered sticks and stones, their playful laughter echoing in the battered buildings. In that moment, life's ordinary joys seemed nothing short of miraculous. Days passed in a blur of relief efforts. The government re-established a communications network. Caches of supplies were discovered and carefully distributed. Makeshift hospitals treated the wounded. The Chronology Coalition was lauded by some as heroes, while others condemned them for meddling with forces they barely understood. Avon found herself in high demand for interviews, but instead of returning to full-time journalism, she collaborated with the coalition to record personal accounts of the time tiers. She felt a deeper calling to preserve honest records of this unparalleled event, ensuring that future generations would understand how perilously close existence had come to fracturing beyond repair. One twilight, while sitting at a volunteer station, Avon stared at her father's watch. She had almost forgotten the swirling illusions of that final moment inside the rift. She recalled glimpsing multiple versions of herself, older and younger, triumphant and defeated. She wondered if each version might have belonged to a distinct path that time could have taken. Part of the city's population believed that the entire ordeal had perhaps been fated a grand cosmic reset of sorts, forcing humanity to stare into the abyss of infinite possibility. Another part simply chalked it up to the cruel randomness of the universe. She closed her eyes, feeling the drum of her heartbeat and the weight of the darkness that had nearly consumed them all. In the end, it almost didn't matter how cosmic or random the crisis had been. What mattered was that in saving one possible timeline, they gave the world a second chance. Yet a lingering voice in her mind asked, had they truly sealed away all the fractures, or was another flicker still out there, waiting for a fracture of existence to re-emerge? Late that night, while volunteers settled into their sleeping bags, Avon slipped outside. She climbed the crumbling exterior steps of a partly demolished building, finding a perch that overlooked the area where the colossal tear had once loomed. The night sky, although veiled by smog, felt oddly still. There were no cracks visible, no swirling lights. A loud crash, a quiet emptiness over a hushed city, her eyes stung with tears of relief and loss. Terrible destruction had ravaged the place she once called home, but at least it was still here. Time, in whatever form it now persisted, seemed to be moving forward rather than looping back on itself. A sudden cool breeze reminded her of the moment the device had hummed to life, bridging 1,000 possibilities into one. She pressed her hand to her wristwatch, cherishing the memory of her father's voice, stable and reassuring in a world that had lost its footing. She breathed in the dust and exhaled the weight of countless timelines. In the days to come, no one could guarantee absolute normalcy, if that term still held any meaning. Yet as the city's beleaguered population rebuilt, they did so with a renewed awareness of how fragile and precious the thread of time could be. They sealed cracks in walls and roads, while quietly acknowledging that they had also just sealed a chasm in reality itself. The next generation would grow up with stories of swirling rifts and shattered clocks, glimpses of eras that both were and were not, Maybe they'd take solace in the knowledge that time, however battered, had found its way back onto a path of forward motion. I even resolved to document everything, the good, the bad, and all the harrowing in-betweens. If there was a lesson in the fractures, it was that no moment should be taken for granted. Each second was a precious refuge from the chaos that once threatened to rupture existence. Sometimes, she thought she still heard an echo of the swirl in the wind, or felt the faintest tug of another timeline on the edge of her consciousness. But as she made her way through the battered streets each morning, she also felt the subtle, reassuring ground of a single reality under her feet. A world reborn from chaos might still carry scars, but it also held the promise of tomorrow. And so she walked on. Even if no one could promise the absence of future rifts, they at least had the knowledge and the will to face them. And that, she decided, was a kind of victory beyond measure.